Today, we're taking a look at the Grumman FF, often known as the Fifi. It was the first complete aircraft designed and built by the company, featuring several novel features for the time, and it helped to establish a fruitful relationship between Grumman and the US Navy that would last for decades to come. Development of this historical aircraft began almost by accident. As mentioned in a previous video on the Grumman JF Duck, one of the company's first contracts was to supply the US Navy with the Model A amphibian floats, the design of which had been given to Leroy Grumman by his friend and former colleague Grover Loening. During discussions of said floats, personnel from the Bureau of Aeronautics asked Grumman if they thought their retractable undercarriage design, of which was used on the Model A floats, could be adapted to work on existing carrier fighters, such as the Boeing F-4B-1, which had entered service in the summer of 1929, or the Curtiss F-8C-4, which was about to do so. Unsurprisingly, Roy Grumman and his colleagues were not keen on the idea of letting other manufacturers benefit from their design, especially as practical, reliable undercarriage of this nature was still considered cutting-edge designs for this time period. Instead of giving the Navy a direct answer, Grumman and his chief designer, Bill Schwendler, set out to design a two-seat fighter that made use of their technology. On the 10th of March 1930, barely 3 months after the company had officially been organized, and less than a month after their discussion with the Bureau of Aeronautics, Grumman submitted preliminary data on a so-called high-performance two-seat fighter. This submission was well received. The Bureau saw the merit of Grumman's design, and on the 29th of March, they formally registered their interest in a project with them. After this rapid start, and in typical bureaucratic fashion of course, things immediately slowed down. On the one hand, the US Navy opened its budget file in 1930 and were greeted with the metaphorical equivalent of a moth flying out of a poor man's wallet. And on the other hand, they had to proceed cautiously before awarding a contract to a completely new and untried manufacturer, Roy Grumman's personal reputation in the field notwithstanding. This delay, however, did have its merits. It allowed Grumman time to work on their design, and it allowed the Navy time to communicate additional requirements for said design. The aircraft that began to take clearer shape on the drawing board was a small, single-bay biplane with fabric-covered two-spar wings. Its fuselage was a semi-monocoque made from aluminium alloy, a first for US carrier aircraft, and it became characterized by a deep forward section in which the main wheels were retracted vertically. The pilot and rear gunner were seated in tandem under an enclosed canopy, still a relatively novel feature at this time, and the armament was to consist of the then standard pair of fixed forward-firing machine guns and one rear-firing machine gun on a flexible mount. All of these guns were 30 caliber Browning M2s, but there was also provision for the two forward-firing guns to be replaced by a single 50 caliber Browning M3 if called for. As adopting Grumman's design into service would introduce several features hitherto unseen on carrier aircraft, notably the retractable undercarriage and the use of aluminium alloys in the framework, and after some prodding by conservative members of the Bureau of Aeronautics, who didn't wholly believe Grumman's optimistic performance estimates, the Bureau insisted that Grumman first provide drawings for a 12:1 scale model that the Navy could build and wind tunnel test. Much to Grumman's satisfaction, and probably some internal grumbling at the Bureau, the wind tunnel tests completely validated their supposedly optimistic performance estimates, and when the Navy had finally resolved their budgetary matter, they requested Grumman to submit a quotation for the design, construction, and testing of a prototype. On the 6th of March 1931, Grumman submitted a quote for $73,975, and it was accepted on the 28th when the Navy formally ordered one XFF-1, along with reserving an option for a second prototype, which they would indeed order as the XSF-1 in June. The naval contract stipulated that the XFF-1 must have a top speed of 190 miles an hour at sea level, a service ceiling of 22,000 feet, and it had to be delivered within 200 days. The delivery date was a cause for some concern at Grumman, as they had a workforce of less than 30, and they also had to waste some of those precious days relocating from their current facility, an oversized rented garage, to something more spacious. Their concerns turned out to be unnecessary, for although their prototype was delivered 76 days behind schedule in 1931, their only competitor for a two-seat carrier fighter, the open cockpit, fixed landing gear Berliner Joyce XF2J1, wasn't delivered until 1933, and its performance could not match Grumman's. The prototype XFF1 flew for the first time on the 29th of December 1931. In this first iteration, it was powered by a Wright R1820-E Cyclone, which gave 575 horsepower, driving a two-blade variable propeller. During the initial Navy trials, the XFF1 met all of the performance requirements, and its top speed of 195 miles sea level exceeded both the contractual guarantee and the 188 miles an hour top speed of the Boeing F4B4. However, the Boeing could significantly outclimb the XFF1, and this, along with additional naval testing on stability, revealed the need for some modifications. These modifications included a minor redesign of the canopy, the fitting of horn balances to the ailerons, the relocation of the arrestor hook further aft, and a strengthening of the undercarriage mechanism to prevent accidental retraction during heavy landings or while taxiing on rough ground, something that had happened once to some general embarrassment. With these modifications, and following a re-engining to a 750 horsepower version of the Cyclone, the XFF1 now matched the climb performance of the Boeing, along with having a new top speed of 201 miles an hour, and the Navy placed an initial production order for 27 FF1s not long after this. The first FF1 was delivered to NAS Anacostia in April 1933, and was initially retained there for service testing. The next 25 went on to the carrier USS Lexington at the very end of the year, where they replaced the Boeings of VF-5B, one of the carrier's two fighter squadrons. The final aircraft went to VF-1B to be flown alongside Curtiss models operated by this squadron from both North Ireland and aboard the USS Saratoga. Not long after this, the US Navy also took delivery of a second variant of the aircraft, known as the SF-1. This was an evolution of the second prototype, the XSF-1, that had been ordered back in June of 1931. Known as a so-called Scout prototype, it differed from the XFF-1 in a number of ways. The two forward guns were removed to increase the fuel capacity from 120 to 165 US gallons, with the offensive armament now consisting of a 30 caliber machine gun mounted in the upper right wing, the provision for two 100-pound bombs to be carried beneath the lower wings, the replacement of the exhaust pipes and town end ring cowling with a NACA cowling and exhaust collector ring, and the replacement of the engine with a 750 horsepower R1820-84. In 1934, some SF-1s were used to test different payload configurations to see if heavier ordnance could be carried by carrier-borne fighters. This included an experiment in which a 1,000-pound bomb was carried on a sway brace below and behind the port wing. The bomb was so large that a skid had to be installed on the brace, lest it strike the ground. Thankfully, this rather hazardous exercise was only carried out a few times before saner minds intervened, on the grounds that carrying a 1,000-pound bomb with a ground clearance measured in inches, not feet, was probably a bad idea. The FF-1s, which by now had been given the nickname of Fifi, and the SF-1s were generally well liked by their pilots and service crews. They were praised for their high speed, exceptional maneuverability, good handling characteristics, and sturdiness. There were some criticisms as well, though. Due to the placement of the upper wing, their forward vision was somewhat restricted, and the narrow track of the landing gear made them difficult to land smoothly. Many pilots also struggled to get used to flying with the canopy closed, though this was a problem common to almost all early enclosed cockpits due to the greenhouse-style arrangements of struts that made up most canopies at the time. The service life of the FF1 and SF1 was quite short. They appeared in that time period of rapid transition that not only saw biplanes give way to monoplanes, but also saw rapid advances in technology across every field in aviation and aircraft design. Furthermore, unlike the British Fleet Air Arm, the US Navy had lost interest in two-seat carrier fighters and scout fighters, and by 1935, after less than 3 years of service, the aircraft were taken from frontline duties. After this, 22 FF-1s were fitted with dual controls and redesignated as the FF-2 trainer. These were distributed to various Naval Reserve Air Bases or assigned to Marine Reserve Squadrons before ending their days as ground instructional airframes when they were too worn out to be airworthy. Though it was outclassed in a short span of time, Grumman's first fighter found some use with foreign nations in one form or another. After completing their delivery orders for the Navy, they had a fair amount of components left over, and so the GG-1, an unarmed demonstrator, was built in 1934. When the Canadian Car and Foundry Company agreed to build the FF-1 under license in 1936, Grumman sold them the GG-1 to use as a demonstrator for the Canadian Grumman fighter. This license-built model was known as the G-23. Some of these were kept in Canada, with the hopes of selling them to the RCAF, but Car and Foundry also found overseas customers. Their biggest export order was for 50 planes, and this was supposedly placed by Turkey, but it was eventually revealed that it was agents of the Spanish Republican government who had placed the order with forged Turkish papers. This export was then declared illegal by the Canadian government, but some 34 units had already reached Spain before the embargo kicked in, and it was here that the Grumman would see its first and only taste of combat. Known as the Delphin in Spain, it was primarily intended for use in the ground attack role, and it made its combat debut in July of 1938. One of these Delphins gained the distinction of claiming the only victory credited to Grumman biplanes, when its crew shot down a Heinkel HE-59B flown by the Condor Legion. But overall, however, the Delphins did not perform well. 3 were shot down, 6 were captured, and 20 were lost in combat and operational accidents. The Canadians would also use the aircraft, albeit reluctantly, when they realised they could not rely on Britain to supply them with fighters in 1940, Britain being otherwise occupied with the Luftwaffe, funnily enough. 27 G-23s were eventually pressed into service and given the designation of Goblin. Though they apparently saw no combat service, they were for a time the only fighters available to defend the east coast of Canada in a time of Spitfires and Messerschmitts, which was hardly reassuring. Thankfully, this now totally obsolete fighter was never needed to defend Canadian airspace. Aside from Canada and Spain, single examples of the Grumman FF would appear in Mexico, Nicaragua, and Japan. The model that went to Nicaragua saw little service before being consigned to the scrap heap in 1944. There it lay until it was rescued, brought up to flying condition, and flown back to the United States. Restored, it is now, I believe, the only surviving Grumman FF to be found today, and it's on display at the National Naval Air Museum in Pensacola. Though their time was brief, being superseded by more modern designs, Grumman's first fighters proved to the Navy that this new company could be a competent manufacturer of naval aircraft. This they were, and they would soon demonstrate this with such aircraft as the F-4F Wildcat and the F-6F Hellcat. But those are stories for another day. As always, thank you all very much for watching, and a special thank you, of course, goes out to the patrons, with a special shout out to Kevin, Deliardo, Bane, FB, Christopher R, Tronathon, Eric Heineman, and John Austin Jr. for their support as Wing Commander tier patrons. Thank you all so much, and I'll catch you all next time. Goodbye.